Well, I'm pleased and honored by this opportunity to introduce Dr. Carl Rogers, and yet I'm perplexed as to how to go about it. How would you introduce him? I suspect many of you know him or know about him in much the same way I do, as the founder of client-centered therapy, as a past president of the American Psychological Association, as the author of On Becoming a Person and Client-Centered Therapy, and as a leader in the encounter group movement. You may not be aware of the fact that in his childhood, part of which was spent on a farm, young Carl Rogers helped facilitate the growth of moths, pigs, lambs, and cows. He tells me that he's currently involved in growing begonias. His first job as a psychologist paid him $2,900 a year to facilitate the growth of children in Rochester, New York. Since then, he's gone on to influence your lives and mine in ways we don't even know about. For he's been helping humanize our culture for years through his writing, teaching, and practice. One way he has influenced me is to make me aware of the inappropriateness of introducing him by listing his credentials, rather than by trying to convey to you something of the person Dr. Rogers is. I've gained a second-hand, but nevertheless very vivid impression of him from working with two of his former students, Dr. Gerard Haig and Dr. William Zalonka, who are my partners. I'm very well aware of how much Dr. Rogers has meant to them both, as a teacher and as a person. I see in them the concrete expression of the influence Dr. Rogers has had on so many clinicians, his concern for the patient as a person, above all, for the patient's feelings and perceptions, rather than for the therapist's pet theory or favorite line of interpretation. I can remember back to my own graduate days in a research-oriented university when it seemed that Dr. Rogers was about the only psychologist of national reputation who openly made a basic professional commitment to psychotherapy as a major concern for American psychology. He did not reject research. Indeed, he was an innovator in bringing research methodology to bear upon the psychotherapeutic process. But it was always clear that the goal of these efforts was facilitation of patients' growth, not merely the accumulation of knowledge. Currently, Dr. Rogers is at the Center for Studies of the Person in La Jolla. He will speak to us tonight on the encounter group, individual and organizational change. I take great pleasure in introducing Dr. Carl Rogers.
Thank you, Tom, for that very warm introduction. On the other hand, I don't feel so pleased about the very warm atmosphere. Quite a number of years ago, there was a musical in which there was a song, "It's Too Darn Hot." I think it went on to specify what it was too darn hot for, and that perhaps isn't appropriate here, but at any rate, for me, this is too darn hot. So if you'll excuse me, I'm going to take off my jacket. Since I'm going to talk about encounter groups, well, first of all, can you hear me at the back all right? Is this a good sound system? I really would like to ask two questions. How many of you have experienced directly, it has been a participant in an encounter group or a sensitivity training group or a T group or something of that sort? I really would be interested in knowing how large a proportion. If you keep your hands up for just a moment, how many of the rest of you feel you've had a pretty good opportunity to know something about what goes on in such groups? Good. Okay, then we won't have to take time in explaining what an encounter group is. I think that the encounter group is highly existential and humanistic in its underlying rationale. It deals with persons as they are now in the group. It respects them as unique human individuals. It is interested in them as subjective beings, not as objects. Consequently, I think a consideration of its influence on individuals and on organizations is highly relevant to a series on existential and humanistic psychology. I want to approach this topic largely from a practical and only partially from a philosophical point of view. When I began to think of this talk, of the possibility of entering into a dialogue with a group like this, and in spite of the size, I hope that it can be a dialogue when we come to the question period, I asked myself questions of this sort. What changes have I seen in and following encounter groups in individuals? What kind of changes have I seen? What changes have I seen in their relationships? What changes have I seen in organizational policies and structures as a result of encounter groups? I don't know, maybe we'll have to close that door to keep the encounter group outside from coming in. For some reason, I found myself wanting to state the conclusions first, and that's a very poor mode of presentation, as any public speaker knows. But that's what I'm going to do, and then later I hope I can give you a feeling for the personal and phenomenological data on which my tentative conclusions are based. I think perhaps I should stress that I'm basing my statements largely on experience with groups facilitated by my colleagues and myself. I believe we have a slightly different emphasis than is popular today. We are mostly receptive and understanding rather than manipulative. We tend to place our trust in the group and in the group process rather than in the charismatic power of the leader. We hope there will be both verbal and nonverbal communication, but we don't side with one or the other of those modes of communication. We wish the group members to develop their own individualized goals rather than having some preset goal, such as happiness or joy or effective organizational behavior. We expect the group process to be somewhat painful if it leads toward growth. In fact, believe that all growth is disturbing as well as satisfying. We don't believe the group experience, no matter how uplifting, is an end in itself, but believe its significance lies primarily in the influence it has on later behavior outside of the group. So it will be seen that we represent only a portion of the vast spectrum of special theories, practices, devices, exercises, and emphases which characterize the group movement today. So then, asking the question from my own perspective, which I've briefly tried to describe, what changes have I seen in individuals following experience in an encounter group? Many images and memories flood in on me as I try to answer this query. Here are some of the thoughts that emerge. I've seen individuals alter very measurably their concepts of themselves as they explore their feelings in an acceptant kind of atmosphere and receive both tough and tender feedback from group members who really care about them. I've seen persons begin to realize and bring into being more of their own potential, both through their behavior in the group and in their behaviors afterward. I have time and time again, seen individuals choose a whole new direction for their lives, philosophically, vocationally, and intellectually, as a result of an encounter group experience. I've seen individuals go through an encounter group untouched, experiencing no significant change then or later, quite uninvolved. And then I've also seen persons who were seemingly uninvolved in such a group show change later in most interesting behavioral ways. I've seen 2 individuals out of the many hundreds in groups I've conducted show what I regard as negative change. One undergoing a temporary psychotic break after the group, the other, whom I later found had shown many psychotic symptoms before the group, undergoing a full-fledged psychosis. Both of those occurred more than 20 years ago, which is quite a while ago to some of you, and I think that they would be less likely to happen in a group that I would conduct today. I've observed a number of individuals who've sought individual or group psychotherapy following an encounter group, where in some instances this seemed a most positive and growthful step, and where in other instances it's a reasonable question whether the group experience brought such rapid and painful change that the individual was forced to seek further help. And I guess this last I regard personally as somewhat unfortunate. Well, let me turn to my second question and again give a highly summarized answer, giving some of my tentative conclusions out of my experience. What changes have I seen in the relationships of persons in and following an encounter group? I've known individuals for whom the encounter group experience has meant an almost miraculous change in the depth of their communication with their spouse and children. Sometimes for the first time, real feelings are shared. In my experience, this has happened most dramatically where participants have returned home each night, sharing their growing insights, taking the risk of expressing their real feelings, whether they're loving feelings or negative feelings, as they themselves have become aware of them. I must say that a great deal of sleep is lost in this process, but the growth in relationship is often extraordinary. I've seen fathers who've gone home able for the first time in years to communicate with their sons, and mothers with their children. I've seen teachers who've transformed their classrooms following an encounter experience into a personal, caring, trusting, learning group where students participate fully in forming the curriculum and in running and managing the classroom and their own studies. I've seen tough business executives describe a particular business relationship as absolutely hopeless. You can't do anything with that guy. And then go home and change that relationship to a constructive one. I've seen students in a seminary where love and brotherhood were the top verbal ideals, contrasting pretty sharply with the reality of complete and lonely alienation. I've seen such a group make tremendous strides toward real communication and caring for one another. I've also seen situations where one spouse, gaining greatly in insight and openness, has gone home after an encounter group and so frightened and threatened the other spouse that the communication gap has become temporarily, or in some cases permanently, increased. I've seen couples face in a group the buried differences between them and frequently reach a real reconciliation, and at other times realize openly that there's a gap they cannot bridge. So I think I can say that I've often seen tremendous changes in the relationships of persons, mostly constructive changes, but sometimes negative from a social, though not necessarily from a personal point of view. And then my third question. What changes have I seen in organizational policies and structures following encounter groups? Here my experiences lead to more moderate, more cautious statements. I've seen situations in which individuals were greatly changed and their institutions changed scarcely at all. I've seen teachers go through deeply moving growth experiences with observations of these same teachers in their next faculty meeting showing little if any change from the sterile meetings of the past. On the other hand, I have seen faculties drop grading systems, place students on all committees, open up channels of administrator, faculty, student communication as a result of encounter groups. I've seen the policy of budget formation in a college completely altered as a result of such a group. I've seen presidents and provosts and deans change their administrative ways in more human directions. I've seen business executives change such stressful and judgmental and I guess to me barbaric practices as annual evaluation of subordinates, for example, into a humanly mutual and constructive feedback. I've also come to recognize that encounter groups, because they foster individual independence, individual openness, and integrity, are not conducive to unquestioning institutional loyalty. That has a lot of practical consequences. Business executives have resigned their jobs. Priests and nuns and ministers and professors have left their orders and their churches and their universities because of the courage they've gained in encounter groups and have decided to work for change outside of rather than inside the institution. I've seen changes in an educational institution fostered by encounter groups, but splitting the faculty into antagonistic groups of those who wish change and those who resist it. In short, while change and growth often introduce turbulence into the life of the individual, change and growth seem almost inevitably to induce turbulence into institutions, a most threatening experience to the traditional institutional administrator. Well, I seem to be giving this presentation backwards, but somehow it appeals to me. So now I'll start to give you the basis of some of these tentative conclusions. I've stated some of the lessons that I've learned and the tentative findings that I've formulated from my experience. But what is that experience? Well, I've tried quite consciously to engage in a broad spectrum of encounter group experience and closely related consultant experience in order to increase my own learnings. I had a 3-year continuous consulting experience with the administration, the faculty, and the students of Caltech, from which I learned a great deal, and I think they learned some things too. Another major learning experience has been my 3-year association with the schools conducted or supervised by the Order of the Immaculate Heart, the college, the high schools, and the elementary schools. I've had very brief experiences, all too brief, usually 2 to 5 days, with the administrators and some faculty members of the 6 Claremont colleges. That was definitely too brief. I had a very exciting experience with a number of trustees and administrators and faculty and students of Columbia University. If you want to ask me about that in the question period, I'll be glad to tell you about that. I've had experiences with the faculty and students of 13 junior colleges, with the counseling staff of several colleges, with presidents of large corporations, with business executives at various levels, with nurses, particularly in administrative, teaching, and supervisory positions, with religious workers of all denominations. I had an extremely interesting experience with what were called ghetto consumers, ghetto health consumers, black and brown members of the ghetto who were on the receiving end of medical care in the same group with representatives of the health agencies who were the health providers. And if you think that was a quiet and calm experience, you're mistaken. I've had experience with university classes taught in encounter group fashion. I've been involved not only in so-called encounter groups, but with so-called personal development groups, task-oriented groups, consultant groups. I've led stranger groups, so-called, and groups of working colleagues. I've led couples groups and adolescent groups. I've led a variety of groups in Japan and in France. And I can assure you, people don't differ that much, even in highly different cultures. I regret that I've had no experience with groups composed of families, that is, where several families together constitute a group, nor with groups of elementary school children, nor groups of elderly adults. But all in all, I've been very fortunate in meeting with an exceedingly wide range of individuals in many different settings. I've tried to be as observant and open as I'm capable of being, and the formulations which I gave first are the best interpretations I can give of that wide experience. Now, as I continue to back into this presentation, giving last the data which presumably should have come first, I find myself in a second quandary. I'd like to talk about individual change as a result of encounter groups. And I jotted down many instances of deep personal change, which I have myself observed. I was tempted to give many of these examples, but then I felt the effect would be sort of unconvincing. It would be like a salesman talk or something like that, overwhelming you with brief and indigestible examples. So I've chosen instead to give you one example related entirely to personal and behavioral change after the encounter group, as recorded in a correspondence extending over 2 years, but concentrated mostly in the 7 or 8 months that immediately followed following the group. Ellen, as I'll call her, the woman whose statements I'm presenting, certainly couldn't be described as typical, but then none of us are typical either. And as I describe the changes that occurred in her, I just would want to say I've observed equally significant changes in many individuals. I'm going to present a number of excerpts from her letters following the encounter group, yet what I present is only a very small fragment of what she wrote. All that I hope to illustrate is that important inner change and its resultant behavioral change can take place as a result of experience in an encounter group. Ellen was one of 2 women in a group of 15 business executives which met for 5.5 days. She was the president of a small technical business. She was rather quiet during the group, but she did talk at some length about the problems she was having with one of the executives in her business, a woman with whom she had a pretty complex relationship. Toward the very end of the week, she also made some mention of the difficulties involved in living with her mother, but she explored this problem very little, and I wasn't really consciously aware of its importance, though I must have had some unconscious awareness of that, because I remember that in parting with her, 4th of July was only about a month away, And I said, I hope that maybe this 4th of July you'll be celebrating your Declaration of Independence. So I must have had some inkling of the depth of the problem. 2 weeks later, she wrote me saying, the insights are still coming and the reverberations are continuous. I haven't noticed a tremendous change in myself, and I know those around me haven't seen much of a change, but I do seem to have opened some kind of a door that was closed before, and hopefully more will open. I think that, as with many participants, the change which occurs is a very subtle one, and certainly a part of that change is a closer acquaintance with one's self and one's feelings. Whether behavioral change would come about to fit these newly owned feelings was in Ellen's mind a real question. Because she concludes that letter, our group continues to recede, and the old habits press around again, including the headaches and the rest of the psychosomatic mishmash. How I wish I could hold on to the group spirit. In the next letter, 1 month later, she first opens up on the problem with her mother. She's writing from her office, and she says, Mother is out until at least 10 o'clock tonight. I'm going to see some friends she dislikes, and when I get home, I should simply say, I went to visit George and Carol tonight. But I'm already quaking with fear that I'll get home after she does and won't have a ready and plausible excuse for where I've been. This is silly. I know it, but I can't seem to fight it. Now, this statement about her fear of her mother is more revealing than anything she said in the group, and indicates the extent to which she is still a little girl, completely under her mother's thumb. Several weeks later, another letter shows that for the first time she's beginning to think about separating from her mother. She says, if I didn't feel responsible for my mother's well-being because of her age, I might have the courage, with moral support from my friends, to set up 2 households. But at 78, she seems too far advanced to just walk out on her. In this letter, she also speaks of the love she feels for George, whose wife, Carol, who was mentioned before, is very ill both physically and psychologically. She says, if I had never known George, I would never have had 1/10 of the understanding, ability to love, sympathy, or tolerance I have now. He made me a human being. But in regard to both the possibility of separation and her love for George, she feels, and I quote, the weight of guilt feelings imposed on me by my mother, such involved guilt feelings, beginning so early in life and culminating in her distaste at my relationship with George. Well, considering her immature and really pretty cowardly relationship with her mother and the guilt feelings she had about her relationship with George, the next letter, only 4 days later, is truly astonishing. She says, a natural opening occurred in conversation with my mother at dinner last night. It was a comment of hers regarding some ideas on remodeling the house, which we've been considering. I gently suggested that maybe we should think about neighboring apartments so I could go to the conventions and meetings without worrying about getting somebody to stay with her, since she's afraid to stay alone in this house overnight. Naturally, one thing led to another, and this morning she was hysterical. There's no turning back now, I'm sure. I left her in tears this morning. As you can imagine, this day is very traumatic for me, a combination of relief that I could do it and revulsion over the act. Possibly we ought just to look at the facts revealed by the letters thus far. Here's a 44-year-old woman who's been dominated all her life by her mother, who's never married, who is still too terrified of her mother to tell her of spending an evening with George and Carol, his wife, but with George, whom she loves. She simply can't stand her mother's disapproval. Yet 5.5 days in a group in which this problem was only mentioned superficially somehow set off a chain of independent thought and feeling and action which represents a completely new direction in her life. The fact that this new direction is undertaken in terror and with a great sense of guilt and enormous insecurity doesn't alter the fact that she's taken a step from which she can scarcely retreat and which may genuinely change her whole lifestyle and her conception of herself. Her next letters portray a long period of inner turmoil as she finds a separate apartment for her mother and takes the steps to move her there. She says, "First there are the feelings of guilt and sorrow at what I've done to my mother. And then there's kind of a burst of sanity, like the sun coming through the clouds, where I think, how ridiculous to be fearful and guilty about something so natural and normal. What harm am I doing my mother?" Their doctor and her friends assure her that her mother will be perfectly okay, but that the big question will be her own adjustment. When it actually came time to move her mother into her new apartment, Ellen really struck the depths of depression. She says, "I have the same old sensitivity to her displeasure and her innuendos about things she doesn't like. The old guilt feelings are back stronger than ever. What am I doing to this poor 78-year-old woman? And yet I know logically that it's not really a terrible thing. Here I am trying to convince myself that I'm doing the right thing when underneath I'm a quivering mass of fear. Why am I afraid of her? I'm so terribly afraid of the hysterics, the tantrums, the tongue lashing, the tears, the accusations. But I don't have to feel guilty. She's been doing things to me all my life that I didn't recognize until the last few years. Strangely, last week, even after the awful hysterics, I felt some of the self-confidence that came from seeing the situation for what it is." I'd like to comment on that just a minute, because many people seem to feel that change in one's concept of self and in one's behavior can come about smoothly. I think that's not true in a person, nor is it true of change in an organization. I think all change involves inner disturbance and varying degrees of pain, in this case really intense pain. Yet the fact that such turbulence is natural makes it no easier to undergo, and each individual's struggle is personal, and each person has the feeling, especially if the change is deep, of being wildly tossed about like a boat in a storm. At about this time, she wrote a letter to the man who'd been responsible for organizing the workshop, summarizing her experience. She says, "As with most of the participants, I went to the group with a completely erroneous idea of my, quote, problems." She tells how helpful the group experience was to her and goes on, "The real problem that I took to the group under my facade was the separation of myself from a domineering mother. This is a real casebook problem. It's written up in every elementary psych text. But a life based on fear and submission is not easily changed. I'm not yet out of the woods, but the going is easier. I know that our group was a big step and that I wouldn't have been able to face my mother with this break if I had not gained some kind of feeling and understanding about myself and others through that experience. I hope you can understand the wonder and hope that I have derived from this experience. At middle age, I have finally achieved some degree of maturity. I'll begin living a life of my own in 2 weeks, after having provided my mother with the safety and security she needs to live a life of her own. So that's about the best evaluation I can give you of the workshop. It helped me find my life. That's not quite the end of the story. After she and her mother were in separate apartments, she found herself going, and I quote, up and down in wildly modulating cycles. She says, sometimes it seems incredible that this is happening. I think the big problem, aside from the worry about mother, which actually is diminishing, is the fact that I seem unable to stand alone. This is where I must use every ounce of will in me. Now, to me, it's fascinating to see that the problem has gradually shifted from her guilt about her mother to the recognition that she herself is the problem. She's having a tremendous time trying to stand on her own feet and live her own life, a tremendously difficult time. Here's a fear that she's experiencing, not one that she's introjecting from her mother's point of view or her mother's values. She is, as she states in one letter, paying a high price for her independence, and yet it's clear that she's making progress in the struggle. She says, I'm 44, but I feel like a 10-year-old lost in the forest. I know I'll find a way out eventually. It's the intervening time that I dread. Through all the separation from her mother, she had usually walked out on the hysterics, having been unable to confront her mother openly. But another letter a month or so tells of a small incident. Her cousin Sally had invited them for Thanksgiving. And she goes on, last weekend, Mother said she didn't want to go to Sally's for Thanksgiving. She had that edge to her voice that is so familiar to me. I didn't say anything, but when she brought it up for the third time, I said, Mother, Sally invited me for Thanksgiving, and I am going. You may do as you wish. She simmered down then and finally said, will you pick me up on Thanksgiving? Ellen goes on, now really, how childish can an adult be? The difference between this attitude at this time and the quivering mass of fear with which she first approached her mother is too obvious to require comment. She's also beginning to gain some real satisfaction in her independent life. She says, I'm learning to cook, and I had some friends over the other evening whom I haven't entertained for years. It was so wonderful to sit around and drink if we felt like it and talk naturally, and I was in my own place. So I can be truly thankful this Thanksgiving. At one point when she was going through the deepest pain and turmoil, I mentioned in a note to her that she must wish at times that she'd never heard of the workshop which got her into our group. But 8 months after that group experience, she says, you asked whether, if I could live over the past 9 months, would I be willing to repeat my group experience? In a word, yes. The group is precious to me. It has given me the new dimension to my life that has brought me nearer to maturity. No, I wouldn't give up the group experience for anything. And even though I've gone through hell many times during these months, I have learned much, and I am grateful for each of these learning experiences. Well, perhaps these few excerpts from her letters will indicate the kind of personal change in attitudes, in confidence in one's own self-worth, changes in behavior, in life directions that an encounter group can bring. It's interesting to think of her experience in light of the questions that many people are asking these days about encounter groups and their values. One common reaction is, groups are often upsetting. They cause friction in relationships. They make people unhappy. Well, in Ellen's case, certainly all of these things are true. Her experience proved terribly unsettling and caused deep unhappiness and depression. It changed her relationship with her mother in such a way as to drive her mother into hysterics. It brought wild fluctuations into her own emotional reactions. One might say What an unfortunate, damaging, and possibly destructive experience. Yet Ellen herself, who has lived through the experience from the inside, knows that she's made great strides in a never-ending struggle to become more of a whole person, a person separate but in relationship, a more aware person, a person who at great cost has earned a measure of freedom for herself. And that courage to be is so precious to her that she would go through all the pain again, if need be, in order to find it. So that's what happened to one person as a result of 1 week in an encounter group. Now I'd like to turn to the question of changes in relationships. I'm going to give 3 examples of the way in which people can relate differently following an encounter group. The first example illustrates beautifully how children can sense a change in feeling and attitude even when the outer behaviors seem scarcely to have changed at all. A mother who'd been in a group with a colleague of mine wrote him shortly after the group was over, "As you know, things are pretty peachy keen with Pete, my husband, and me, but as you probably noticed, I never did say that about the children. I was bothered about the squabbling between Marie and Alice. I was bothered about Marie's bedwetting. I was bothered that I couldn't give them a lot of affection. I was bothered because they never really talked to me. I was bothered by some of the hurtful things Pete and I could say to them. So when I came floating home Sunday with this new real self, I was anticipating a response of sorts. What I didn't anticipate was the quickness and the intensity of the response. Because shortly after she got home, it was bath time for Marie, the 10-year-old youngest daughter. Her mother asked Marie if she could scrub her, and she said yes. And she goes on, the mother goes on in her letter, "In the space of an hour, we talked about menstruation, God, the devil, heaven, hell, hating someone so much you wanted them dead, stealing candy from the kitchen, nightmares, monsters in the window. Of course, we'd talked about such things before, but never with such completeness. Alice, who's 15 months older than Marie, came wandering into the bathroom and shared in this experience with us. I ended up scrubbing her also. This surprised me that she wanted me to bathe her, as her body is becoming adolescent and she's very self-conscious about this. Marie said, 'What did you do at that meeting?' Learn how to be nice to kids?" I said, "No, I learned how to be myself, which is really pretty nice." And then I'd like to give a second example in a letter written to Bill and Audrey McGaw 1 year after they'd conducted a group for engaged and married couples. It speaks for itself. The man begins, "This is a letter that I've started to write 100 times. It's about what happened and what is happening. It's filled with love. It's filled with tears and joy and love. As I sit here now writing to you, tears well up in my eyes and I'm overcome by emotion. I've never before been able to write a letter like this. This is what I want to say. This is to thank you, to let you know that you passed it on. You did your job. The time was right, and I picked it up, and now I have it, and I'll never lose it, and I'm passing it on." He says, "Eileen and I are married, and Eileen and I are living together, and we have problems, and we fight, and we bitch, and we love one another. We wouldn't have this today if we hadn't met you both. But we did meet you, We spent several days together, and we broke through. It's not perfect, but it happened at the right time, and we were fortunate to meet with the right people. We were ready, and you changed the path of our lives. We now know what is possible and achievable. This base, this emotional security in our marriage, has provided for me a springboard, an opening, a vantage point. Open, flowing, pouring. Words can't adequately describe what has really happened to me. You know what it is. I have it. It's wild. And he says, I know now why I've waited so long to write. Now I'm certain. It's been over 1 year, and now the fear is gone. I'll never lose what I now have. I realize that what I have merely puts me in a position of accepting greater responsibilities. Now I understand why you, Audrey, and you, Bill, must go through what you go through with each group. I guess I'd like to add one more picture of a teacher and her pupils. A letter was sent to an elementary school teacher who had been in an encounter group several months before, inquiring what, if any, outcomes there had been for her. She writes, "You asked what happened to me. Pure and simple, someone got to me, the inside me. I listened and I heard, have heard, and have been hearing things I've never listened to before, and love it. Results? All I know is it's fun. I've listened to my students. I asked them if in the past I had turned any of them off or not listened. The biggest thugs in the class all raised their hands. Also, they're the most sensitive. I've had the busiest, most arousing, sapping, exciting, fun-filled, fulfilling, and happiest month since I started teaching, and it hasn't stopped yet." Her observation about the problem students, the thugs as she calls them, is particularly interesting. It's often true that youngsters who are creating problems are more sensitive to interpersonal relationships than are others. Her comment also raises the interesting question of cause and effect. Were these children thugs and consequently she didn't feel they were worth listening to? Or did they become thugs because they felt they were not heard? It opens up a whole new perspective of thought on so-called problem youngsters in the classroom. Her statement also suggests how involved both students and teachers can become in learning when communication is real between teachers and students. I don't wish to be misunderstood in these examples I've given. Such things as I've talked about don't happen to every mother or to every couple or to every teacher. But that they happen frequently makes the group encounter the most exciting and potent interpersonal experience that I know. It can help to free people to be spontaneous and angry and loving and sensitively aware of life. In short, it can permit persons to become truly human in their relationships with one another. Then finally, I want to give one example of organizational change. I thought of a dozen instances of significant change in the attitudes and policies and structures of organizations and institutions, which I would like to tell you about, but I've chosen only one. I wish I could relate it with the vividness with which it was related to me by a teacher who'd had long experience in this school. It was a Catholic boys' school managed by a Catholic order which had been a prestigious school of high academic standards and high morale in a middle and upper class white suburb. Over a decade, the neighborhood had changed drastically until at the time of this report, the school was 75% Mexican American, 20% black, and 5% Oriental and Caucasian. It had become a ghetto school in a ghetto neighborhood. Standards had fallen, morale was low, apathy and alienation had crept in, the drug scene was an important part of the ethos, and involvement by students was almost nil. But in spite of this, there were, so far as the faculty was concerned, no serious problems with the school, for the tight discipline enforced by the order kept a semblance of conventional education as a comfortable facade. All this broke wide open during and following a particular school dance. Students, but particularly the student leaders, blatantly brought, used, and distributed alcohol and drugs at the dance. As if this were not enough, the student body as a whole conspired and united in trying to conceal all these activities from the faculty. In other words, the rift between students and the school was complete. The beginning of change was inaugurated by the principal when he suspended classes, called a meeting of the whole school, and said, in effect, "We all know we have a serious problem. Let's talk about it." His own openness and that of the other faculty encouraged dialogue and discussion. First, it was kind of smug criticism by, quotes, good students of other students who'd done, quotes, bad things. Why did you do these bad things at the dance? But gradually, students took the risk of discussing deeper causes. They said their classes were boring. They said the teachers seemed disinterested. The studies they were engaged in were quite irrelevant to their lives. Discipline was repressive and meaningless. Dress codes made no sense in the students' world. There was no emphasis on the history and identity of minority groups. These things were passionately discussed, but they were not squelched. Dedicated faculty members remained open and non-defensive, though clearly jolted and hurt. The meeting ended on a note of hope. The upshot was that during the brief remainder of the school year and during the summer, faculty and students worked together on the problems. Then, in some desperation, 4 members of the counseling staff, which had been under particular fire, enrolled in the summer training program for group facilitators made available by the Center for Studies of the Person in La Jolla. Their experience in the encounter groups in that program was so enriching that they felt greatly strengthened in their desire to remain open in communication, to trust the students, to encourage students to participate in all educational and administrative aspects of the school, and to introduce an encounter group atmosphere into all aspects of high school communication, policy making, and into the classrooms themselves. The results of these efforts, both before and after the encounter group experience of these 4 faculty members, were startling. The faculty stated that they would trust the students to be responsible for themselves in matters of attendance, tardiness, conduct, drugs, dress, and grooming. Students were expected to become involved in the school in a manner acceptable to their peers. If their conduct was not acceptable, the students were responsible. 70 selected students and all the faculty, even the maintenance staff, had their expenses paid to meet for 3 full days in a rustic resort out of town where the plans were made for the coming year. Well, the opening of that school in the fall was in stark contrast to that of the neighboring ghetto schools. In the public schools in the ghetto, police and private security guards were much in evidence, as were fear and hostility. In parochial schools, the opening sessions were devoted to the strict rules and the penalties for breaking them and the organizational procedures. At the high school, which is the focus of my report, students were told that they were trusted, that they would certainly make mistakes, and that the important thing was that they learned from their mistakes. What were the outcomes? First, some of the more controversial ones. Some other schools refused to play with teams from this school because some of the athletes had long hair, sideburns, and mustaches. The students had felt that all of these were quite natural in our modern culture and had approved them. Another thing, strong ethnic activist groups, Black Student Union, United Mexican American Students, were formed. They wore berets and emblems. They demonstrated. They brought intense criticism from a shocked community, a fear and criticism which continued. But as these groups found that their creative thinking and influence and power was welcomed in the school, their more extreme behaviors diminished. And another controversial aspect, as the year wore on, many faculty members simply could not take the new policy, until by the end of the year the faculty was deeply divided. A great many of them left, and there was a deep flavor of bitterness in what had been a united school. This was so marked that some of those who had helped to inaugurate the new policy felt that it had been a failure, and they were very deeply discouraged. Well, such doubts didn't have much effect upon the students. Attendance, since it was not required, increased greatly. Tardiness simply disappeared as a serious problem. The drug problem, certainly on the school grounds, was sharply decreased. Classes which had been dull and boring were enlivened by pungent discussion by a disadvantaged youth, and faculty members had to struggle to keep up. Most incredible of all, many seniors applied to and gained scholarships to four-year colleges. This in a ghetto school in which almost no one ever went to college. I don't want to understate the problems. Some faculty endeavored to return to the authoritarian methods of the past with very divisive results. It became clear that freedom cannot be revoked. Well, no, as I think of Czechoslovakia, it can't be revoked without great difficulty. Some faculty members became very frightened of the new and unknown path on which they were embarked. The very small minority of white students became, in many cases, hardened and hostile toward what was going on. A good many of the parents were disturbed and upset by the new developments, and it was difficult to communicate to them the new philosophy and its rationale. There can be no doubt that the school was more disorganized, more chaotic during this year than it was during the previous year. To me, this illustrates in very brief form many of the things I feel that I've learned about self-directed institutional change. Encounter group experiences and an encounter group type of atmosphere in an institution can definitely bring about highly constructive change. But it can also bring about sharp division between members of the establishment, can be upsetting to the community, can be deeply threatening to those who are bound by tradition, and can thus raise the question of whether it is constructive change or disaster which has occurred. Yet the group about which we should be most concerned, those who are being served by the school, have in overwhelming majority found it to be a freeing, releasing, life-giving, involving, responsible learning experience. So while change might have occurred more slowly and with less pain, and mistakes were made that might have been avoided, the result appears to me to be positive. Open and honest communication of feelings as well as thoughts, recognition of students, faculty, and administration as having a basic equality as persons, encountering each other on the real issues of the organization does bring real and probably irreversible change. Well, I've purposely chosen a drastic and controversial instance of organizational change, partly to show the potency of the spirit of trust engendered in the encounter group. I could have selected much more moderate illustrations. I hope I've presented to you enough of the raw data to indicate that the conclusions I stated at the outset are not illusory. Experience in an encounter group can set in motion profound changes within the individual person and his behavior, in a variety of human relationships, and in the policies and structure of an organization. I think that this would be a good time to take the break that I understand is customary, and then you can come back with plenty of questions, and as I understand, you can write out questions if you want to too.
Dr. Rogers has chosen some questions. We have a mound of questions here, and I regret that we probably won't be able to get to all the written questions, but we've sort of rapidly sampled them, and we'll take some of the written questions, and then rather than try to cover them all, we'll give you a chance to ask questions from the floor. Go ahead.
We certainly were flooded with questions. This looks like the night after election or something like that. There were several questions of this sort. What about the Center for Studies of the Person? Could you give some details about the training available and the direction of the research? Center for Studies of the Person is not an educational institution, is not a degree granting institution or anything of that sort. The one training program that we offered is one that I mentioned briefly in the talk. It's a training program for group facilitators offered during the summer. And I have a small amount to do with that, but it's mostly run by three of our very good staff members, Drs. Medder and Colson and Doug Land. It has some distinctive features I think I'd like to talk about just a little bit. This last summer it was a 3-week training program, and they had 3 of them during the summer. Took in about 240 people. Then there was another one in Denver, another one in Champaign, Illinois, but I'll just stick to the La Jolla program. We don't believe in trying to certify people. We don't claim for 1 minute that we can, in 3 weeks, train somebody to be the complete group facilitator. Nor do I think we could do it in 3 years. Consequently, we give no certificates, no diplomas, no anything, except that our experience over the last 3 summers is that people who come there go away definitely better equipped to facilitate groups. And we feel that's realistic rather than trying to give some stamp of approval. You are U.S. certified beef number. So that's our philosophy of it. It is also, I guess, personal, cognitive, and practical. A lot of the time is spent in encounter groups A lot of time is spent in cognitive learning about various procedures that have been and are being used in groups. And then during the last 2 weekends, each pair of trainees is given the opportunity to co-facilitate a group. I guess I wouldn't have had nerve enough to inaugurate that because some of these are people who've never before facilitated a group. And I felt this was taking kind of a chance. Actually, I think we've had more enthusiastic letters about people who've come in for those weekend groups. We offer a little bait saying that since these are trainees, there is no tuition, and all you have to take care of is your own expenses, however you take care of those. And the numbers sometimes are fantastic. Last summer when we had the poor judgment to have just 2 programs, we had 600 people there on one weekend and 800 the next. So we're talking about, to me that's very interesting because it indicates the grassroots demand. In other words, if it weren't for money, a great many people would want to get involved in encounter groups. That's what it seems to show. Well, I didn't mean to get so far afield on that. But the address of the Center for Studies of the Person is here on the blackboard. If you want to write to the La Jolla program, Center for Studies of the Person, you'll get announcements of that training program. What are the directions of our research? Well, those are extremely varied. We're involved in an educational innovation project, trying to bring about self-directed change in a school system. Some of our people are involved in a study of drug use and abuse among adolescents. I could go on. There are a number of projects. If you want, write the center and ask them for one of our brochures. That'd give you a notion of what we're up to. One thing about our research that I think I might say is that we've gotten rather cool on typical orthodox empirical research. We feel that the kind of research that is being done in the human field is wrong in 2 ways. First of all, it's based on an outdated Newtonian concept of science, and we need a new human science, and I don't know exactly what that should be. But I think at the present stage of our knowledge, it would be a great deal better if it were a naturalistic study of people, not starting out with too many hypotheses, not trying for great precision. Psychology has really gone down the wrong road in trying to imitate the hard sciences, and it has, in my judgment, gone down the wrong road. In trying to imitate the hard sciences and produce precise, neat experiments. And you can do that, providing you pick a small enough and sufficiently irrelevant topic of study. Well, after that, I better go on to the next question. What about the changes in you? One of them I've just mentioned. I have done a great deal of empirical research in psychotherapy, and it's partly my own experience in it that has made me feel, yes, I think we've made contributions through that research. I think we've uncovered and validated some pretty subtle factors in interpersonal relationships, but it leaves me quite dissatisfied in general because I feel that you get through with a piece of empirical research and you feel, yes sir, we've measured just about everything except the thing that we really wanted to know. And that's almost invariably true. In some of the hard sciences, they're not in such a bad way. Well, that's one change in me. I think another change is that due to being in encounter groups myself, I think I've become very definitely more freely expressive of my own feelings and emotions in groups, in staff, in my family. I suspect I would also be more expressive of my own feelings in a one-to-one relationship with a client. But I haven't done any of that in recent years, so I can't be quite so certain of that. I haven't done it because of circumstance. I just can't tie myself down to a client schedule. Other changes? I don't know. I've gotten a lot older.
Here's one that's relevant to that.
In your encounter groups, do you ever experience personal peak experiences? I like Maslow's writing on that, but I never know how high is a peak. I certainly have experienced some very significant and meaningful things, and perhaps those are peak experiences. I certainly have seen individuals go through what I would surely from the outside define as peak experiences, yes. Trying to think whether there are any other changes in me that would be of great significance to you. Don't know of any. I'll go on to the next. How would one obtain training as a facilitator of encounter groups? There, I've already talked about that. Does the orientation of the counselor make a difference to an encounter group atmosphere? I think it makes a great deal of difference. That's why I took a few moments to describe the kind of way that we tend to approach groups. One reason we do not give certificates after a training experience is that we feel that some people still have characteristics that make them, in our eyes, probably not very promising facilitators. If a facilitator has a specific goal for the group in mind that he doesn't make clear and evident and open, the atmosphere of that group is going to be very mixed message. It's going to be very poor. If a facilitator has too many unresolved problems of his own, God knows we all have problems, but if he has problems of his own that he feels he must work out with the group, must express to the group, I'd rather encourage him to be a participant in a group or a client of a therapist. I think some people really unwittingly exploit a group by using it to try and resolve their own problems. I don't like that. Personally, on a philosophical basis, I don't like facilitators who endeavor to manipulate a group even though the manipulation is for the good of the individual and the group. It's like I don't know, it takes me back to too many parental situations. I'm doing this for your own good, and I just don't like it. I've seen people who've responded very much to that kind of thing, who feel they gained a great deal of help out of it, so I'm not putting it down. I'm just saying I don't like facilitators who manipulate, even with the best of intent. I don't like facilitators who are cool and aloof. One tradition that has somehow grown up in the group movement is that the trainer, this applies more to the term trainer. The trainer is the person who stands off to one side, really, takes little or no involved part in the group, but is very sharp and perceptive as to what's going on in the group and says, well, you see now, the whole group is struggling with the problem of leadership, or the whole group is doing this or that, or this faction is doing this and you people are doing that. I don't like that on two grounds. In the first place, when I've tried statements like that, it seems to me all it achieves is to make the group self-conscious. Oh, am I being hostile? Well, then, oh, I see. That kind of thing that I don't like. It cuts off spontaneity. Then the other reason I don't like it is that such a trainer or leader, whether he knows it or not, is setting a model for the group. And what model is he setting? He's saying one thing and doing another. He's saying, now here's a chance for you people to be spontaneous, to express your feelings, to interact freely with one another. Of course, I myself will hold myself aloof. You won't know what my feelings are, and so forth and so forth. Well, what do people do? They tend to model on what he is, not on what he says they should do. So that you get sometimes, as a result of groups, people becoming, quite perceptively and intuitively interpretive, but not spontaneous. So, well, those are some of the things that I feel can make for a less satisfactory group, things that I don't happen to like in a facilitator. I put it in that personal way because so far there certainly is not enough research. People with whose approaches I disagree quite sharply have, I know, had very positive effects on individuals whom I know. So I'm just saying this is my predilection and my opinion. How do you create the safe environment for the client or for the group? I think first of all that a safe environment is created primarily by, I'll put it in personal terms, by my own attitude if I'm the facilitator. If I really trust this group, that gets communicated in all kinds of ways. It's just like these children who knew their mother had changed the minute she came home, even though she didn't say anything to indicate she had changed. A group tends to know pretty quickly whether it is trusted, whether it is going to be permitted to be free, or whether probably there are a lot of hidden limits that they'd better be cautious about and discover. Then another small thing that comes to mind on that is that I think the first moments of a group are highly important. I've seen group leaders start out by saying, now we're together, and the first thing we want to realize is that everything that goes on in this room is confidential. We want to agree among each other that none of us will speak of this outside the room. Well, immediately you have, there are going to be a lot of things we don't do and so forth. It is not a freeing, safe kind of atmosphere. You think, I've got to look out for a number of things. I like to start a group with as little as possible structure, just saying sometimes, here we are, I bet we'll know each other a lot better by the end of the weekend. I wonder what's going to happen. What's my opinion of the group itself setting up rules? If they want to, I've never seen one that was successful in doing so, except maybe to set up a rule that they're going to meet an extra meeting or something like that. Usually, though, when one member suggests a rule, there are 3 others who differ and 2 others who want to set up a different rule, and pretty soon it all goes down the drain. I don't think people very yeah. I think such rules as not talking outside the group do create problems. people ask, well, don't you get into trouble on that? To be perfectly honest, I never have. I think that in the climate of trust that develops in a group, people trust each other, also trust their own judgment. So they may talk about the group outside, but not in a way that's going to do harm to some individual. I think people are, I have an enormous admiration for the real sensitivity of people, and it shows up in their, I think, in their trustworthiness. If someone has opened up in their group with a very confidential material, they're not going to go around using it against him. I have never had that happen in my groups. I just never have had it happen. Well, here's quite a different question. Where and when can one see your movie? Was it Journey into Self? It isn't my movie, it's our movie. Bill McGaw produced it, and Dick Farson and I were the facilitators. And Stanley Kramer got so interested in it, he helped with the editing. And I'm sure that gave it a big boost in getting an Academy Award for the best feature-length documentary of 1968. I didn't like the thought of it being in theaters only. It may or may not be shown in theaters, but at any rate, it is available through Psychological Cinema Register, and I put that address up on the board too, on a rental basis only. I think the rental is $50, so you aren't going to rent it just for yourself, but perhaps in a class they might want to see it. Why don't we take a question or two from the audience?
Okay.
All right. What about this Columbia thing? How much time we got? That clock is an hour behind. You said it wasn't. It still is. That's why they had the heat on. A month or two or a year behind the time. At that Columbia workshop, I wish I had had more to do with the planning of it. A group of us were called in to help facilitate it after it was pretty well all planned. But there were about 55 people from Columbia University. It included the president and a number of the trustees and a number of the administrators, a number of the faculty, and about 15 of the students. About equal groups, in other words, of all those. And then, unfortunately, to my mind, they let in also a number of interested outsiders. They were very prominent and clearly interested outsiders, like John D. Rockefeller III, who wanted to see what was going on, and so on. But I would describe it in this way, that there were some very exciting confrontations between students and faculty and administrators. I can illustrate that by one evening when we decided to meet as a total group. Most of the time we met in small groups. And the students sort of said they would present their case. And due to a remark of one of them about, I guess, the notion that some buildings might burn next spring or something, one crusty old federal judge who was a trustee gave a beautiful defense of the fact that no dispute is ever settled except by rational discourse. I really think it was quite an eloquent presentation and very convincing. And so then the students replied, and they literally took him apart. They said, "Why are we here this weekend? Because of rational discourse? Not on your life. It's because we occupied some buildings last spring. Why is President Kirk no longer head of this university? Process of rational discourse? Not on your life." And they just went down through a whole list of things, which was very exciting. Also shows the real risks in that kind of thing, because if they think that that a dispute really is settled by violence. I think they're mistaken there too, but they showed that at least there were very much two sides to the issue. Well, that's one small sample of what went on. I felt that the outcome of the weekend, and it was just a weekend, it was much too short, was reasonably constructive if it had been the first of quite a number. And we made that suggestion and recommendation very strongly, and to the best of my knowledge, that's been the end of the story, even though President Cordier was very cordial about what had happened and said he was going to try to carry it on. Another learning for me from that, I came away, I think I went there feeling that the trustees would be the most difficult group to handle, or maybe the administrators. That they would be more closed-minded than anyone else involved. I came away feeling most discouraged about faculty. Trustees were crusty and opinionated and hard-boiled, but when they had been socked with other attitudes, they could open their minds some and say, yeah, there is something to that. The administrators, by and large, were reasonably open. But the faculty, I don't know, I've never used this phrase about them before, but they had kind of a rubber attitude. Nothing, you know, you could dent them, but nothing really touched them. I felt the faculty attitude was summed up by one man in my small group who said, "There's no communication problem at Columbia University. I talk with students every week." Well, and they really seem to feel, I'm exaggerating somewhat because this wasn't true of all faculty, of course, but they seem to feel that, oh, they had the answers. There was nothing too seriously wrong. They didn't seem to recognize that higher education is on the brink of not only crisis, but destruction, in my estimation, and there seemed no adequate realization of that on the part of the faculty. One of the students in the closing session said, "We live in two different worlds, and I don't know whether we can ever get together. And one thing that differentiates the two worlds is that our world has feelings in it." And I thought, that's it, brother, you said it. I'm letting Tom pick the speaker so I won't be accused of being partial.
I'm going to ask too myself here, exercise my authority. Because of my own involvement with Esalen Institute and the local Topanga Center for Human Development, these two questions concern me. I'll read them both. Why do many of the people in groups, or as the result of groups, become such zealots so that they insist on conducting groups with their friends? The second question is, in my experience with people who have participated in encounter groups, I find that they are suddenly authorities on group sessions and force groups on their so-called friends. I find this uncomfortable and distasteful. Why do they find this necessary?
I suppose it's one of the less desirable aspects of human nature that if you get enthusiastic about a new car you just bought, all your friends have got to buy that car. If you've been to an encounter group and it has had a lot of meaning to you, you're going to try to sell it to everybody you know. And that, I think, is truly unfortunate. And people usually learn, if they've really had a good experience in an encounter group, that they don't wish to impose this experience on others, that it's no damn good if it's imposed on others. That's opposite to the whole rationale of it. And so I think they do recover from that temporary disease, but it is sometimes a disease that they show.
Let's have some questions from the floor. Yes.
Who has done encounter groups with young children? What are the results?
That was a question in here that I was going to answer, and I even jotted down the names. The people who come to my mind, and I can't tell you too much about the results, except they seem to think that it was favorable, are Ron Lippett and Matthew Miles at Teachers College Columbia, and then Ann Dreyfus, who's with the what used to be the Family Therapy Center in Los Gatos, but the Human Communication Center in Los Gatos, has worked with fairly young children. The others have worked with youngsters down as far as third and fourth grade, and from the accounts I've heard, quite satisfactorily. It makes me think of one story that I might bring in. In a sixth grade, the children had been in encounter groups. At the end of the year, they were going to graduate. It was the culmination of their training because they were going on into junior high school. And in the middle of the final ceremonies, the teacher turned to the group and said, this is the culminating ceremony of your experience in this school, and yet this is your own special ceremony, and yet some of you are not paying attention. And one sixth grader got up, emboldened, I'm sure, by encounter group experience, and said, why do you call this our ceremony? You chose what the program was going to be. You chose who would speak. You said what songs we would sing, so forth and so forth. All that the teacher could do at that point was to change some of the songs, but I can assure you that to ones of their own choice, but I can assure you that next year the group will plan and conduct its own ceremony.
Yes.
By that, do you mean individual group therapy? What's the difference between an encounter group and individual group therapy? There were several questions along that line. I'll read one that goes right along with it. Do you feel the encounter group may cause a greater change of behavior than individual therapy? You regard that as a different question? Okay, I'll answer them separately. I'm amenable. I think that the differences between individual therapy and group therapy. Oh, I missed your question then. I beg your pardon. What's the difference between group therapy and the encounter group? I think that the difference is primarily in the attitude and situation of the person coming to the group. The person who comes to group therapy usually does so because he is really suffering from some situation in his life. He really wants help. The person who comes to the encounter group is usually a normally functioning person. Sure, he has problems, but he's not crying out in pain. And he comes there to see whether he may not find further fulfillment for himself, further actualization of his own potentialities. And you say, yeah, but what's different about the group itself? Well, of course, that depends somewhat on the person who's conducting it. But if I were conducting group therapy on one day and an encounter group on another, I question whether you would see much difference in my behavior, and I don't think you would see a great deal of difference in the process in the group. You would see perhaps deeper things, perhaps more emphasis on the past in the group therapy experience, but Well, there I should emphasize that it does differ a good deal with the person who's leading the group therapy, because they can make it quite different from an encounter group. But to my mind, the group process can be quite similar in both instances. Not a very satisfying answer. Let me answer this other question, which I feel is related, even if, well, I see now it isn't that closely related. Do you feel the encounter group may cause a greater change of behavior than individual therapy? For more years than I would like to mention, all of my, well, a great major part of my professional time went into individual therapy and research in individual therapy. I've been interested in groups, I didn't call them encounter groups, but intensive groups, for more than 20 years. But I've usually devoted only a small portion of time to them until recently, largely because I felt it's difficult enough to get an understanding of a one-to-one relationship and the dynamics of that, and what I was particularly interested in was how persons change, and to understand the dynamics of personal change in individual therapy seemed sufficiently challenging, and I was sort of discouraged about the possibility of ever doing research on anything so complex as the interactions of a group. I think my attitudes on that last point have changed as I've had more experience with the encounter groups. I think that they produce sometimes a different kind of change, but I guess I believe that perhaps they produce more valuable social change. I say this very hesitantly and tentatively. More valuable social change than individual therapy usually does. Qualify all of those words. Partly because to change your behavior or to change your attitudes and to express your feelings in a group and to find your feelings and attitudes accepted by others who are right there and who aren't paid to accept your feelings is a very compelling experience. And then to change your behavior in the group gives you at least a little practice experience for changing your behavior outside in other situations. I guess perhaps the best answer to that is that if I were to go back to to working in a counseling center as we had at the University of Chicago, for example, I'm sure that I would try to focus most of the effort on an encounter group type of effort. Take one more from the audience?
Yeah, down in front.
Yes, if there are no degree-granting institutes for facilitators, in your opinion, there are some facilitators who shouldn't be facilitating. What criteria should a person use in getting involved with any particular encounter group?
Could you hear that? If we don't give certificates to group facilitators, and if I feel that some people are not very satisfactory group facilitators, what criteria should a person use for choosing a group he might enter and the facilitator who might be leading it? Is that right? I wish there were some nice, neat answer to that, and there isn't. I think if I were going to enter a group, I'd try and make some inquiry about the person who's going to facilitate it, see if you can find other people who've been in groups with him or her. That's just good common sense. Then another thing that I think needs to be carefully weighed and thought about, but to be considered as a possibility. If you are in a group and you feel this is not what I want, he's not the kind of person I respond to, I don't believe I will get help, then I would consider leaving it. When I say consider leaving it, you do have to take into account the fact that quite often some people feel initially, well, he doesn't know his business and he's no good. I think I'll get out. And I guess I would say don't get out prematurely. On the other hand, don't sacrifice your whole judgment when you get into a group. If you find that this really is not for you, there's always the door.
Yeah, I'd like to add a comment to that and see, you earlier at the very beginning of your lecture described your philosophy of groups, and a few of the phrases I remembered that appealed to me especially were avoiding really the manipulation of a group, so that the facilitator doesn't really run or promote certain things, but really invites the participants to really design and direct their own learning. And I guess part of my feeling would be is if you find yourself in a group where the leader seems very manipulative or coercive and is really forcing rather than inviting or suggesting, then I personally would feel my own freedom to grow my own way was being intruded on.
I like that. It also leads me to make one further statement that the thing that always used to amaze me about individual therapy, and it amazes me about groups too, is that often the therapist or the facilitator essentially serves one function. He gives permission for the person to be as personal and deep as he wants to be. That seems like a very simple thing, but it works wonders. If you and I meet on the street, you don't feel free to tell me about what's concerning you because you don't feel you have permission in that kind of situation. If we meet in an office even, you may not feel that. But if I'm the facilitator of the group and you're a group participant, you look to me, and if I can give you that permission to be yourself as freely as you can, that's the occasion that most people are looking for, I'm convinced. Maybe I should pick up a few of these.
Yeah, I have 4 here that also fall into a cluster we might try. I think they're a little bit related. A number of people in their questions are concerned about overly vulnerable people, someone on the verge of a breakdown. You mentioned 20 years ago you did have a couple incidents of breakdown. How are these problems dealt with now? How would you be dealing with them differently now than perhaps you and other leaders did 20 years ago?
Well, in the first place, I wouldn't be frightened of the group attitude. I've developed a great deal more trust in the group. Actually, I've learned for myself, and I suspect this might be true of other psychologists, that if someone in a group begins to show some fairly bizarre behavior, it is very difficult for me, because of my past training, no matter how hard I try to put it out of mind, to be making statements to myself like, boy, that's purely paranoid behavior. Oh my God, that's a straight schizophrenic remark. Now, members of the group have better sense than that. Well, let me say, and that kind of remark, which I can hardly resist making, almost, or at least partially, causes me to turn this person into an object. Ah, he's a paranoid. Now, the group participants, fortunately, have better sense than that, and they insist on continuing to treat him as a person. Why, what you said is just crazy. You're crazy, man. And that is a far more respectful remark than some subtle reaction on my part or the part of some other facilitator. I think of one incident where we weren't of much help to this woman, but in the last meeting, the last session of a weekend group, she showed what I'm sure existed before, a full-blown paranoid psychosis. She went around each member of the group and she knew who they were and why they were there. One of them I had planted to spy on the others. Another one was from, I don't know, CIA or somewhere. It was real far out stuff. She was really completely irrational. And a very intelligent and perceptive dean of women who was in the group, who sat next to me, leaned over and said, "This is where you've got to take charge. You've got to do something." That was it. I didn't respond to her because my honest response would have been, "But I don't know what the hell to do." And you know, the group showed the most magnificent capacity for dealing with that very difficult situation. Some of them chose this opportunity to walk out and take a smoke or get a drink of water. One woman admitted that she did that partly because it kept her from strangling this person. Others clustered around in a little group and began to talk about another matter. And who handled this very difficult person? The dean of women, who'd said, "You've got to do something about this." She engaged her in an educational conversation that soon got her off of the bizarre aspects and got her to talking like a rational human being again. As I say, I'm sure we didn't help her much, but the group handled that situation in a way that was far more creative than anything I could have dreamed of. Let me just pick one of these, because there's some, after all, a lot of these people send in questions. Did someone answer Ellen's letters? What effects, if any, of this impersonal kind of communication did this make in Ellen's life? I did respond to Ellen's letters. Because we were 2,000 miles apart, I responded mostly just with understanding. I didn't attempt to make any suggestions or certainly no interpretations or anything. I just wanted to know that I was trying to stand with her in what she was going through. And though it's not perhaps not in the material I read tonight, she was most appreciative of those notes. I think they were all short notes. I didn't attempt to reply at length, simply because it indicated somebody cares, somebody is interested, somebody does understand. And so to that extent, it was not an impersonal communication, and it did make a difference. And I'm glad the question was raised, because in a sense the story is incomplete without knowing that. She didn't just send her letters into empty space.
Justin, I want to, Justin, I'll call on you at some point tonight, but only when I call on you, okay? I will give you your chance, however.
Okay. Another card that was handed in. Are you scheduled to lead encounter groups a weekend or longer, and when, and how do people enroll? Personally, I have come for various reasons to limit myself to groups which are working together. I've come to like those better than stranger groups, because though I think they're not as dramatic, I think the results are more long-lasting. And also that I don't quite know how to handle the question of those who might want to enroll in encounter groups with me. So that if you're a president of a corporation, you could join a group next week, providing you have the funds. Or no, but at the Center for Studies of the Person, there is a workshop project which does hold encounter groups about every 2 weeks, and people are invited to enroll and may enroll, and members of our staff do conduct those encounter groups.
There's a related question. How does one go about getting into an encounter group in Los Angeles? I might comment on that. There are all kinds of groups in Los Angeles. And I'll mention a few organizations that run such groups. I don't mean to imply that these are the only groups or the best groups. One such organization is University of California. UCLA does have a sensitivity training program, which is quite similar to encounter groups. It's run by the Institute of Industrial Relations, and you can get information about that program, I think, simply by calling UCLA Extension or the Institute of Industrial Relations. Angus MacLeod is the coordinator of that. There are also, within the university, there are courses that are in effect encounter groups. There's a course in the business school that I've taught a number of times. I think it's BA 182, something like Leadership Principles and Practices. Anyway, somewhere in the business school there are courses. Then there are nonprofit organizations such as the Topanga Center for Human Development here in town. Synanon runs their own particular kind of encounter group. There's a place called Elysium Institute, which emphasizes encounter and nudity and body awareness. Any other organizations you're aware of? You want to throw in a plug here, way in the back? Excuse me? The Free Clinic apparently offers groups. They're in the phone book, right?
There are three questions on cards that I really feel are quite significant, and I'd like to answer. I'll try to answer them briefly. Is it possible for a naturally very quiet, non-aggressive, and reserved person to gainfully participate in an encounter group, especially if they are middle-aged with a lifetime pattern set in their rather withdrawn disinterest? I don't know, to me that's not a laughing matter. With a lifetime pattern set in their rather withdrawn disinterest in people or groups. I would say in some groups you might have a very rough time. I think in the groups that are conducted by CSP, you would be permitted to get as involved as you wish to get. I think of one person, an educational administrator who belongs to a group that almost fits that description, who felt that the main thing he got out of a group he was in with me is that he found he could stay quiet if he wished and simply be a relatively uninvolved observer. And he felt that was quite precious to him to find he wasn't coerced into it. He'd heard so many things about groups. And I was quite intrigued to hear a year later that he was handling his relationships with his faculty in a very different fashion that could only be attributed to his experience in the group. He was being much more open with the people he dealt with and not just formal and going by the book. So that's one reason why I feel a person like that, yes, could gain. Then a somewhat similar question. Well, when you're already a fairly together person and what you gain from a group is a greater sensitivity to and empathy towards other people, how do you retain this sensitivity and act upon it when you return to the real world of business, for example? One sort of semantic question, sometimes you wonder, which is the real world? Are we so sure that the world of institutions and procedures and roles is the real world? It's a world that dominates, yeah, in that sense it's real. When you've been in an encounter group, the other world seems much more real. But the question is a very relevant one, because many people feel, yes, I had a very good experience in the group, and then when I got back, I just couldn't maintain it. That's one reason I'm interested in working with a number of people who all come from the same place, same organization, or the same community, or whatever. Because then they don't go back all alone trying to explain something that's inexplainable to colleagues who think they must be a little bit off their rocker to be talking of an experience in the way that they do. So one comment would be, if you're going to an encounter group, try and get someone close to you to go with you. Or if you're coming from an organization, if you're coming from a school, try and get 2 or 3 people from the school to go with you, so that when you go back, you won't be completely isolated. There will be others with whom you can carry on the spirit of whatever you learned. Then I think that another thing that is needed is in ourselves as facilitators. I think we need to devote more time and emphasis to helping people think in the closing hours of the group especially, now, what is this going to mean when you get back home? And even role play situations. I had a good time with a business executive who knew he'd have to drop back into his same old role, so I played him, and he played the tough boss he was going to have to deal with, and I think he really learned something from that. But at any rate, we do need more effort on knowing how to translate the gains from an encounter group back into this other world, at any rate, of everyday life. And then another one that I'd like to comment on. Would you please discuss the differences, if any, in organizational encountering as contrasted to, I guess it's conventional encounters. Anyway, difference between an encounter group and, say, a task-oriented group in an organization. I think the latter is a very fruitful enterprise, because many times people who would be fearful of entering a straight encounter group, where they might feel, oh my gosh, I'll have to reveal myself, I don't want to, are able and willing to discuss task problems in their organization. And yet, if that is well conducted, if people are interviewed first to find out what the real problems are, well, the real problems usually turn out to be 2 parts policy and 3 parts people. That it's so-and-so who's the son of a gun who's causing all the difficulty, and it's that other department that nobody could get along with that louses everything up. So when the task-oriented group begins to focus on the real problems of the organization, they very soon get down to those particular interpersonal relationships that are causing trouble. And then it gets to be indistinguishable from an encounter group, but it does have the flavor of dealing with the obstacles to the organization. TRW Systems has done a great deal of work along this line, team building groups, task-oriented groups, and so on. Sheldon Davis there has really spearheaded that effort.
There's one good reference on that. Those of you who are interested, it's from the Harvard Business Review by Chris Argyris, A-R-G-Y-R-I-S, T-Groups for Organizational Effectiveness, several years ago. It's a very good basic summary of this issue. My own suspense and curiosity have reached the point where I'd like to hear your question, Justice.
I don't know you, but evidently you are known.
One comment to this chat before the question. When you were asking about the facilitators without degrees and checking up on them, my feeling also is that we have to check up all on the therapists with degrees. Okay?
I would agree with that.
I feel you said something that really touched me, was important to me. When the little girl was taking the bath, and she sensed she could bring thought to her mother that something about hating someone so much that you could even wish them dead. I found that in my own personal experience and with a number of my friends, the problems began when we wished parents dead, and when I was taught this is good and this is evil, and if you have angry or evil thoughts or feelings, then you happen to be evil. And what I'd like to ask you is, how can I help my friends? How can I help myself work with rage that's been repressed for years? What if that mother hadn't gone to that encounter group and that little girl repressed perhaps the rage that she drank in from her mother and she was never able to express? What can we do when we have the rage? How can we get it out?
I'll try to answer that to the best of my ability, and I also want to enlarge it a little. I think that each of us probably have different types of feelings that are for us the most buried feelings. For some it is rage, for some it might be fear of sex, or for another one it might be fear of being tender and loving. A lot of people are really deathly afraid of being loving. So I just want to broaden the scope of it a little bit. I think it's easier to think of ways in which we could prevent that than to give some nice, neat answer on how to deal with it when it's well established. But just as a fantasy, and this fantasy is beginning to become reality in some places. Suppose that children from an early age had the opportunity, perhaps first in a family group, and then in kindergarten and first grade and so on, to really express the feelings that they possess. I think this would do more to defuse the building up of rage or of fear or worthlessness or whatever than anything that I know. For people who are, well, let me just add to that for a moment, so that when you become parents, if you're not that already, I hope you can provide an atmosphere for your children where they will not be fearful about expressing their own feelings and attitudes. Now, what to do about attitudes that are both deeply buried and piled up very strongly? I know no other avenue than expression, and there perhaps some of the perhaps both in individual therapy and in encounter groups, I think some facilitators are more skilled than I in thinking about new and imaginative ways to let people express rage or fear or whatever it is. Role-playing, or putting a cushion there and pounding it to pieces, or a lot of other ways in which rage can be brought out. The only thing that should be added is that when it has been piled up for 20 years, it's not all going to be dissolved in one expression. It's going to take time and awareness and a recognition of, yeah, this thing that I'm feeling is that rage again. That's what it is. Then little by little, I think the person is able to choose whether or not to experience rage in a situation. But it does take time, and I don't pretend to have any neat answer to it.
One afterthought occurs to me as one example of some work with adults is George Bach's fight training, where he tries to help married couples get their anger out in non-destructive but still pretty direct ways. It's not exactly the primitive infantile rage, but I think it helps some people. And I think I'd like to just add to Dr. Rogers' point, I think some encounter group leaders are especially skilled at dealing with rage and are comfortable with it, have maybe techniques for bringing it out with safe limits. I think it would help to have an encounter group if you're going to do this in an encounter group, where that was a shared contract, where the other people there also were, willing and ready and valuing of dealing with rage, so that they could stay with that process. I just want to pause here. I mentioned, since we're talking about encounter groups, there is another UCLA program that some of you might like to know about. It does take place Wednesday afternoons, and the title of it is Encounter Groups. I checked, and I understand there still are some single admissions available for each of those. It meets November 5th, 12th, and 19th, 3 more times in the afternoon. So some of you who want to follow up your interest in encounter groups can do so through another UCLA program that way. Where is it? Okay. It's 1 to 3 p.m. at the University Synagogue, 11960 Sunset Boulevard in Brentwood.
And if those who are interested could come up and see that.
Yeah, I'll leave this here for a little while after the evening.
Here's one on paper that I'd kind of like to deal with. Concerning growth, change, and anxiety. In the case of a healthy personality where one has grown used to growth and change, will anxiety still be present? In my estimation, yes. No significant change comes about even in a healthy personality without a certain degree of anxiety. It isn't as much as in the fearful or maladjusted person, but to face the possibility or necessity of change in yourself creates a certain amount of fear, a certain amount of anxiety, of wondering, where will this path take me? Because when you change, you are always venturing into the unknown, and that's a somewhat fearsome project. There's one other comment I'd like to make on that, because I think it's extremely important in our modern culture. Technological change is zooming, and the whole question of our time that isn't very often faced or very well faced is, will man be able to change as rapidly as his technology? I don't know. I wish there were a lot of research being done on how rapidly can the human organism assimilate and adapt to change, because that's going to be one of the crucial questions of the coming years. I think we already know that you can't just change continuously. That leads to more insecurity than most human beings can stand. So it is usually a rhythm of change and assimilation, and more change and assimilation, and so on. But we really are terribly ignorant on that. It's not a question any previous century or culture has had to face, because change has always come so slowly that no great change is demanded during your lifetime. If you've changed some during adolescence, okay, you'll do for that generation. That's no longer true. We've got to keep changing throughout our lives, or we will not be able to adapt to the multiplicity of changing problems that exist.
In the back, the lady? Yes. Yes.
Yes, a couple of us tried to talk with her as to the possibility of seeing someone, but as you might expect from the picture I gave, she was adamantly against that. She needed no help. She knew what the facts were. We were the ones who were concealing the truth. Yeah. Well, that leads to a more general issue I'd like to take up. We have found that some type of follow-up is really very important to the participant in the group. It's not only important to the facilitator, he ought to know what's going on, but it's important to the participant. I think one little incident would bring home what I mean. Another chap and I conducted a very moving and I think undoubtedly successful encounter group weekend with a group of teachers all from one school. And then about 2 weeks later, he went up to that school to visit them and talk with them, and there was an opportunity for any of them who wanted to talk with him to see him and so on. And his report of that was that it wasn't that they brought terribly significant problems to him. The main impact of his going there was that they began to really believe way down deep, this person is interested in us. It wasn't just that weekend, which seemed like such an unusual experience. It wasn't just that he seemed to be interested in us then. He really cares enough about us to come 100 miles to visit us where we are. And that, I think, had fully as much impact as anything we could have done. And I find the same thing when we write out a few weeks afterward or a few months afterward. What meaning has it had for you? I think it helps to not only help them to think through where they are, but it helps them to realize that as facilitators, we're not playing a game with them. We were and are sincerely interested in them.
Wow, a lot of questions.
Over here.
Yes, over here.
The whole question has to do with what about older individuals entering such groups, and what's my attitude toward that, and so on. Would we notice the generation gap still more if we did? On that, I think definitely not. I think that if older people became more free in expressing themselves to each other, they would also find themselves much more free in their communication with younger people. I feel that you're calling attention to a good but largely untouched area, namely the possibility of work of this sort with older people. I'm fortunate, even though I'm an older person, in being involved willy-nilly in it. But let me add one other thing. I would wish very much that such a group might be composed not only of older people, but of people of varying ages. I think of one group where there was a very wide discrepancy of ages. I've forgotten just how wide, but it was from 18 to 60 something. And a number of the older participants were concerned about whether they were sort of a drag on the group or whatnot. But it became a very involved, concerned, moving group. And at the end, people said, would you have liked it better if we'd all been of one age, or were you very conscious I was older than you were? And the answer was, well, no, you were just Josie. You weren't somebody who was 55 years old. In other words, the older people became persons to the younger, and certainly the younger people became persons to the older, so that I think it could quite directly be a way of helping to bridge the generation gap.
Jane?
What's your personal reaction to growth centers like Kairos and Esalen and Topanga, and like as far as their legitimacy and usefulness, things like that?
What's my personal reaction to growth centers like Kairos and Esalen and Topanga and so on? There are only 2 of the 3 that I know personally, so I can only, but I'll let you guess as to what ones I know. I think that such centers serve a very useful purpose in a number of ways, very useful cultural purpose. One thing is that often at such centers there is a possibility for leaders with quite different ideas, quite different theories and so on, to try out things that may prove to be quite worthless or at least not very useful. But that's a part of social experimentation that someone ought to find a place for. So that part of it I really approve of, even though sometimes I don't think very highly of certain of the activities that go on. Then there is one, and a lot of very good work goes on in such centers. I do have one growing reservation about them that I don't want to overstress because I don't know how much importance it has. But I wish there were some other pattern that could be found rather than having people come from a wide variety of places and situations, coming to such a center for a week or a weekend or whatnot, then leaving and going back to their separate environments where often they are somewhat isolated from others who've been there. And consequently, the tendency is to return. Let's get a fresh charge and go back out to the world again. And that, I think, can lead to the so-called group addict that I don't quite like. And I wish, for example, I wish, well, here's one thing that comes to mind. I wish the centers could send people out. If they're 15 people who want to come from X community, send a facilitator out there and have the group right there in that community rather than at the center. That, I think, might be more meaningful. In other words, get it somehow rooted more back into the everyday situation. Wow.
Yes.
I'll just define one form of a group addict. The form I have that makes me the angriest. There's some people who've been to quite a number of groups whom I have called old pros, and you can spot them in the first 15 minutes of a group. They know how you're supposed to behave in a group, and they're quick to tell you, no, you're talking about the there and then. Please talk about the here and now. Or, but what you said doesn't represent a feeling at all. What's your feeling about that? And so forth. And in other words, they tend quite quickly to set up a structure of unwritten rules which the newcomer is supposed to guess. He never can quite tell when the next thing he says may be right or may be wrong. But he's supposed to gradually feel his way. Well, I don't like that. I think it has a very inhibiting effect on a group. So I must confess my anger usually rises pretty quickly at such people, and I express it.
This problem got bad enough so that Esalen at one point recently had a group. It was called a group for the overgrouped. And yes.
You have suggestions that would delinquent institutionalize you, and if so, what's been your experience? And if not, considering all that's involved in being, a delinquent in an institution, what do you see as the usefulness and non-usefulness?
The whole question is about groups in institutions where delinquents are institutionalized. An associate of mine, Ann Dreyfus, conducted a number of groups in what was not, it was really a children's home, but as you probably know, in such a place, usually a large number of the children are delinquent, the others maybe haven't been arrested, but they've been in difficulties. those were very successful. She did get them away from the home, if possible, to conduct them, and she was not herself a regular member of the staff. And both those things, I think, had great advantage. Then a priest who is on our staff, Bob Willis, has been working with a group in the prison, and he feels this has been one of the most rewarding experiences he's had. Again, he's from outside, so he isn't part of the regular staff. I think it would take, at least with the present setup of our correctional institutions, a rather unusual person to be both on the staff of the correctional institution and to conduct an encounter group in that institution. But if the institution is willing to bring in someone from the outside and are willing to agree to a few simple conditions, namely that they're not going to pry into what goes on in the group, and that this is a separate part of their lives, I think it could really mean the difference between being continually squashed and having an opportunity to become a person.
We really have time for only one more question, and I'd like it to be from someone who hasn't asked any questions in the whole lecture series so far. All right. Yeah.
If you couldn't hear that question, the punchline was, do I know of any even tendencies toward encounter groups among the nation's military? Two comments on that. I don't personally know of any, although I would not be too surprised to find that there might be some such, but I'm sure they would be few and far between. I have had quite a number of military officers in groups that I've conducted, and it's been very rewarding to have them in such groups, because to see them change from roles to human beings very often is something to see. The nearest thing I know, and it's quite far from the military, but it does have to do with government, there were a number of highly successful groups conducted in the State Department. And then due to budget cuts and due to the leaving of one man who'd helped to sponsor it, that was cut out. But that is, I want to stress though, that was a very significant opening wedge, and I think it will come back again, because the ambassadors were sufficiently compelled by their experience to want to hold encounter groups in their host countries. In other words, they might even include nationals of the countries they are ambassadors to. We might even develop communication, who knows?